Hey everybody, welcome back to the Japanese garden. In this episode I am finally building the first actual building of this series after doing a lot of foliage, terraforming and rock work of course. And it's honestly not just about the aesthetics, it'll be quite a simple Japanese tea building which you commonly see in these kinds of parks. It's also something that is, I think, quite important to have for your guests in these kinds of parks. For any kind of facilities, mostly eating food and drinking tea. I'll explain a little bit more about that along the way, but first I'm procrastinating a little bit here by working on the rockwork and foliage in this area, because this will be the area where the tea house is going to be built in the upper left corner of the screen right now. And I wanted to make sure that at least the surrounding area of the tea house was a little bit done, just so that at the end of building the tea house and kind of along the way I can kind of tell what the context of the building is going to be. Because one thing that I do feel with these Japanese kinds of tea houses, and actually yeah, let's just get right into the building itself. I was going to talk about that later in the video, but it might just make sense to segue into it now. The thing about these houses is that they're quite small and they're quite simple, and one of the biggest distinctions between, for instance, a Chinese garden and a Japanese garden is that where a Chinese garden is very much centered around the buildings, and the buildings are really a large focus of the garden, and you're supposed to look at the garden from the perspective of the building. These Japanese types of gardens, and especially this kind of garden where it's a strolling garden or a garden around the lake, it's something that is supposed to be looked at from different perspectives. You're just supposed to discover the different views of the garden as you walk through it, and it's not necessarily supposed to be seen from inside a building. So these buildings aren't really so important because they're not really the focus of the garden, and if anything, they're just something to gawk at, something to be part of the sightlines. I suppose in a way kind of be the weenies of these gardens if you want to put it in theme park terms. But it's not so much a focus, it's just to be part of the landscape, to establish this natural landscape. And so I think what you'll see with a lot of these small tea houses, but also other kinds of buildings in Japanese gardens, is that they tend to do what a lot of traditional Japanese buildings tend to do, and rather than standing out, they kind of blend in with nature. There might be a few trees in front of the building, or it's just kind of hidden. For instance, there's this little tea house in the Rikugen garden, which is underneath these big trees, which makes it really charming, especially when it's dark and you can just see the lights in the distance of the forest. But it's not really a center point of the garden per se, it's just kind of part of the view. And that's also why the building in this episode will be pretty simple, and why it honestly won't take that much time to build either. And why the focus is still kind of on doing the foliage and everything. And when it comes to this area over here in the entrance, I just wanted to make sure to fill this in as well in this episode, because so far I feel like all of the foliage in the garden has been of the very not so dense variety, where it's just manicured bushes and strategically placed Japanese pine trees. But in a lot of gardens you'll also find some parts of the garden where you really have narrow paths walking through forests with very dense foliage as well. So that's what this part, and hopefully also the other part of the garden, will be more like. I imagine it'll be nice because this is the entrance of the garden, at least one of the two entrances. I think it'll be nice to make sure that the entrance areas are one of these more dense foliage parts. So you come into the garden itself, and you don't really see the center point of the garden itself yet. You don't see the lake yet. You just have some narrow paths that wind through a forest. So you kind of have a section of the garden to kind of be immersed into the garden a little bit. And only after you've turned a few corners through this dense forest do you kind of see the lake opening up in the distance. At least that's what I found happens with a lot of the gardens in real life in Japan as well. To take the example of the Rikugen garden again, there's also this little area where there's a few small buildings where you enter the garden, there's a large cherry tree, but you don't see the lake yet. That's at the center of the garden. That one really only appears once you actually go further into the garden itself. So yeah, there's that, and besides, I did want to try and get more variety into this garden, because if it was just, you know, those low density trees and manicured bushes everywhere, it would get repetitive really quickly. So that's a little bit of the rationale behind how I'm making this garden. Just realized that as with a lot of videos about a certain topic, you should not do a drinking game with me saying the word garden. I'll try to overuse it a little bit less in the rest of this video. But yeah, it's not much that you can do about it. That's the topic of this video in the end. Something that I also can't really avoid is doing all of these little fences. It's obviously something that takes quite a bit of time, and it's not the most interesting to do, but it's something which I thought was quite a big part of these gardens. They kind of demarcate that maybe you shouldn't be walking on the grass in these places and just kind of stay on the path itself. And I found a lot of these very low, tiny wooden fences of different varieties in the gardens in Tokyo. And even if they don't really stick out so much, it's something that you don't really notice that much until you really pay attention to it. I still think it's an important part of the garden. Never mind that the paths in Planet Coaster don't have any curbs, and I think the look of a curbless path without any fences or curbs is a little bit weird, but I think that placing these little fences in there looks a tiny bit better than just using the Planet Coaster curbs. What I also found pretty interesting about these is basically 99% of that video which I did make about Japanese gardens, I was using these little wooden posts and fences on the side of the path to attach my camera onto, which is pretty handy. You can actually get some really cool views of the gardens with these things, and they're a perfect thing to attach a gorilla pod to, so that's pretty neat. But that's not what they're really intended for. There are definitely some areas, by the way, where you can walk on the grass, like some of the areas where I left the little fence open and put like some stepping stones or something up a hill, because that's something that I've seen quite a few times in these gardens as well. Anyway, onto I suppose the main dish of tonight. This is gonna be the tea house, and I'll be spending a lot of time, honestly, making a pretty simple building, just because I wanted to get the composition and the scale of it right, and because of that, it doesn't use the actual in-game roofs, or well, it uses an in-game roof piece, but not in the way that you would use in-game roofs, which is set at a certain incline. And it uses at many points also windows for walls and stuff like that, just to make sure that everything is slightly off-grid and not quite the way that, you know, walls and roofs would be placed normally in Planet Coaster, because I was kind of very picky about the angles of the roofs and the size of the building, because that's honestly the only way that I can make this building stick out. It's not going to be a very detailed building, it's not going to be a very large building, so I wanted to make sure to get the size and shape of the building as much as I wanted to. And now I have to say at this point, I took a lot of inspiration to the point of pretty much, honestly, copying the basic shape of the building from the tea house in Kiyosumi Garden in Tokyo. And I definitely want to say that because I feel like I would be very dishonest if I were just building this and not mentioning what I took it from, because it's so heavily based on it. And honestly, I didn't exactly know what to do if I'd have to come up with my own complete design for a Japanese tea house, because I feel like I'd very quickly go into territory that wouldn't be realistic or that wouldn't be true to the style. So I was trying to play it safe by basing it as much as I could on a existing tea house. And I do have to say that doesn't go too far beyond the roof and the size of the structure, because it's really mostly the roof which I based on the Kiyosumi tea house. But still, it's something that is really similar to it. Only difference that I suppose I made on a large scale is that I added another wing to it on the right side, and instead of being a completely open tea house, because the one in Kiyosumi Garden is more or less almost a pavilion because the entire thing is entirely open, this thing will have some railings on the sides, but also sliding walls, so it's more of an actual building, I would say at least. So yeah, it doesn't feature what a lot of people tend to associate with Japanese architecture in having those heavily detailed roofs which curve upward toward the side, and honestly those are really just a minority of roofs in Japanese architecture. A lot of the times they're much more simple and they're really just straight roofs, but they're still very Japanese style to the way that it's a roof with a gable like this, yet with these cornered roofs on the sides, and the fact that there's two different roofs stacked with the lower one kind of sticking out and giving a walkway along the water. So yeah, overall it's still a very Japanese shape. It's just not as heavily detailed as you might see on some pagodas or temples or stuff like that. I mean, realistically, this would also just be a tea house for a little garden, or a pretty large garden, but it's just a tea house, so I don't think it would have to be quite that expensive. And a lot of my struggle here was trying to get the wooden posts and all of the walls right, since everything is slightly off-grid, and also playing with textures was quite important. You can see me looking for the right wooden texture at a few points in this video, just because when you've got such a simple building, especially when you've got a very minimalistic building, I think it's a lot of the look of a building is in the texture, as well as the shape and composition of it. So I just wanted to make sure that I got the textures that I liked. I wanted everything to be a little bit rustic, and some of the wooden textures in Planet Coaster are pretty bright and pretty new looking, so I kind of messed about with a few different textures there. Also, sometimes I still kind of have to discover the new wooden textures that came out of the adventure pack in the the spooky DLC, I should say, because I didn't play that much with those, definitely not in this kind of theme, and I never really had a session where I explored all the new pieces, so sometimes I still kind of need to get used to those. Oh yeah, and then there's of course the wooden planks on the side here, making that very typical fence shape where you have two horizontal beams and then small vertical beams as decoration in between that. It's a little bit decorative, I suppose, for this building. Could have done with something simpler, but I think it looks pretty neat on this. And besides, there's not going to be that much detail on the building otherwise, because I ended up removing a lot of detail in the end. You can see me adding a door here with these window-ish looking paper slides as well, and I ended up removing those in the end because it doesn't really make sense. At this point I was still thinking these walls are just going to be standard walls, they'll have windows and doors in them, but at some point I figured it might actually be nicer to make these into the sliding walls which you see in a lot of traditional Japanese architecture. So every grid space is basically a wall that you can slide in and out, and with that you can either close or open the building. So that's something which I'll be doing with this later on, and that's why I'll be removing the door and the windows at some point. And the same goes also for the little wing of the building on the side here. There isn't really too much of a function to this part of the building, honestly, because it doesn't really need it size-wise. These tea houses are often really small, but I think it looks a little bit better, and it adds a bit of a counterweight to the main part of the building. So I like the addition of this, so I decided just to add it for looks. In the end, the building is kind of for looks in there anyway. I'm obviously just pretending that this is an actual tea house and that guests will be able to use this, and hell, that the walls can be sliding, but obviously none of this is actually going to happen. This is Planet Coaster in the end. But yeah, I think these tea houses are quite nice. Unfortunately, I never actually did anything in any of them. I never actually bought something in these tea houses, but you will find them in almost every Japanese garden, certainly if it's a strolling garden around the lake, and they tend to just have some really basic services. Pretty much all of them sell matcha, the Japanese green tea, and also mochi, which is those rice cakes, which honestly I find kind of disappointing, but I think I've made a lot of people mad with that sort of unpopular opinion. But yeah, green tea is pretty awesome, so I kind of regret not ever getting any of that in one of these tea houses, but a lot of people just kind of use these to sit down for a bit, or look out over the lake, or whatever. It's a bit of downtime. It's a bit of downtime in your day if you're visiting one of these gardens, and probably also a cool place to have an actual tea ceremony. So yeah, that's why this is here. I don't know how many other buildings I'll be adding to this garden. Maybe like a toilet building or something like that, because actually a lot of these things also have public toilet buildings, and usually you can go to the toilet for free in these gardens because you have to pay entrance fee, which is still really low. Typical entrance fee for a Japanese garden is like $2, $3, or $4, and you can stay there pretty much the entire day, so that's pretty good. And there's lots of really good facilities in these as well, and they certainly don't try to rip you off on anything. The toilets are usually free, and getting tea or candy is usually pretty cheap as well. You more or less just pay for the garden to be well maintained and preserved, because these things are really old and they are kind of a cultural tradition that they're still continuing. I know I've said this in the Japanese garden video about Tokyo, but a lot of these are really some of the only remaining traditional old landscapes that you can find in the mostly modern cities of Japan, because a lot of the old buildings have been demolished or lost in fires or wars or whatever, and these gardens are pretty much in the original states that they were designed in hundreds of years ago. So that is kind of the what attracts people to them. And besides, they're also kind of a similar thing to parks in that they have a public function of just being a place to relax or cool down or escape from hectic city life or whatever. So obviously they should be pretty cheap and easily accessible. It does strike me though that these gardens are kind of different than your typical park, in that people really only go to these gardens to look at them. And sure, it's a sort of relaxing thing, but it's not the same thing as when you go to like Hyde Park to play frisbee or to go cycling or running or whatever. Really, these gardens are typically pretty quiet, and really people just go here to take pictures or just enjoy the view or something like that. And I guess in that sense it is different from just going to a typical park. You're usually not gonna have a standard picnic in here, which is interesting because hundreds of years ago these were very often made for families to have events in and festivities or even hunt or whatever. And nowadays they're really almost like an open air museum in a sense. Not quite, but I feel like it's somewhere in between that and an actual park, because if you do go to Japanese cities, they'll have Western style parks as well. So this really kind of fills a unique role in that. Now here's a little bit of foliage which is a little bit more experimental. I wanted to try and make one of these hills which is completely filled by shrubbery. Not entirely sure how well it's gonna work out, but I think the next episode will be an important point to judge that, because in the next episode I'm gonna try to make the path to go to the top of this mountain for a good view of the rest of this garden. So yeah, thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.